Most Americans couldn't find these islands on a map. That changes today. A super typhoon just made direct landfall on US territory. American soil, American citizens, American families, and it hit with the kind of force that rewrites a community's history into a before and an after. The islands of Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands just got introduced to the rest of the country in the worst possible way. This is what happened. This is what it looked like. And this is what comes next for the Americans. Nobody was paying attention to. Let's start with the landfall itself, because the numbers alone don't tell the story, but they are where you have to begin. The storm made landfall with sustained winds recorded at over 170 miles per hour. The atmospheric pressure at its center, which is how meteorologists measure the raw intensity of a tropical cyclone with precision, dropped to levels that placed this system among the strongest landfalling typhoons ever recorded in the Western Pacific Basin. Reconnaissance aircraft flying directly into the storm in the hours before it hit were sending back data that made forecasters go quiet, in the way that experienced people go quiet when they are looking at something they don't see often. This was not a near miss. This was not a glancing blow from an outer rain band. The eye wall, the most violent ring of the storm, where winds are fastest, where the surge is highest, where the rain falls so hard it becomes physically indistinguishable from the ocean, passed directly over populated land, over homes, over schools, over hospitals, over communities where people were sheltering in the strongest structures they could find, listening to the world outside come apart. The eye wall passage lasted hours. That is the detail that separates a catastrophic typhoon from other natural disasters in terms of what it does to the people inside it. An earthquake is violent and terrifying, but it is over in seconds or minutes. A tornado at full intensity passes a given point in under a minute. A super typhoon eye wall sits over a community and grinds. The worst winds, the worst rain, the worst surge, all of it sustained for 2, 3, 4 hours without meaningful relief. People sheltering through that kind of event are not waiting out a few terrifying minutes. They are enduring an experience that has no parallel in ordinary life, where every minute feels longer than the last, and there is no certainty that the structure around you will still be standing by the time it ends. Now let's talk about where this happened, because the geography of these islands is central to understanding why this event matters beyond the storm statistics. Guam is a small island in the Western Pacific Ocean, roughly 30 miles long and between 4 and 12 miles wide, depending on where you measure. It sits about 1,500 miles east of the Philippines and 1,500 miles south of Japan. It has been American territory since 1898, when it was ceded to the United States following the Spanish-American War. The people of Guam have been American citizens since 1950. They serve in the United States military at per capita rates that exceed virtually every state in the Union. They pay federal taxes. Their children are born American. Their passports say United States of America. The Northern Mariana Islands, a commonwealth in political union with the United States, whose residents are also American citizens, lie to Guam's north. Saipan is the largest and most populous island in the chain. Tinian and Rota are smaller but also home to American communities. The total population across Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands is well over 200,000 people. These are not remote outposts. These are not uninhabited atolls that appear in legal documents but nowhere else. These are functioning, living American communities with schools, hospitals, businesses, churches, military bases, and families that have been American for generations. Guam's capital, Hagåtña, has been a settlement for over 4,000 years, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the Pacific. The Chamorro people, the indigenous inhabitants of Guam and the Northern Marianas, have a history on these islands that stretches back millennia before any map called them American. And a super typhoon just hit all of it. The storm surge arrived before most residents fully understood it was coming, which is how storm surge works, and why it is responsible for more deaths in tropical cyclones than any other single factor. Surge does not announce itself the way wind does. Wind builds gradually. You can hear it intensifying over hours, feel the pressure changes, track its escalation from uncomfortable to frightening to violent. Storm surge comes differently. Water levels at the coast begin rising, and if you are not watching and measuring carefully, the first indication that the surge has arrived is not a wall of water in the distance, It is water on the floor of the room you are standing in, and it is rising. Along the most exposed coastlines during this landfall, storm surge measurements in the immediate aftermath indicate water heights of 15 to 20 feet above normal sea level. 15 to 20 feet. Stand in a room and look at the ceiling. In many homes, that is where the water went. In single-story structures, and a significant portion of residential housing in both Guam and the Northern Marianas is single-story. 15 feet of surge is not a flooding event. It is a submersion event. The structure, everything inside it, everything that was not moved to high ground beforehand, goes under. The coastal communities that took the worst of the surge are the same communities that have historically been the economic and social centers of these islands. The areas closest to the water, the fishing communities, the commercial waterfronts, the older neighborhoods that grew up around the natural harbors, absorbed the surge's full force. These are not the areas of new construction with the highest building standards. These are often the areas with the oldest housing stock, the most historically significant structures, and the families who have lived in the same locations for multiple generations. Those neighborhoods are gone in a way that takes time to fully process. Gone is not a figure of speech here. Gone means the structures no longer exist in recognizable form. It means the landscape has been physically rearranged by the combination of surge water moving in and surge water moving back out as the storm passed, because the outflow of surge as a storm exits is in some ways more destructive than the inflow. The water rushing back to the ocean carries with it everything it collected on the way in: vehicles, appliances, building materials, personal possessions representing entire lifetimes. All of it gets dragged back to the ocean. What remains is not a flooded neighborhood waiting to be dried out and repaired. It is a cleared zone of debris and foundation slabs. The wind damage extends far beyond the surge zone. The eye wall of a storm at this intensity covers a significant area. In a well-organized super typhoon, the radius of maximum winds can extend 20 to 30 miles from the center. On an island that is itself only 30 miles long, that means the entire island was within the most destructive portion of the storm simultaneously. There was no part of Guam that was sheltered from the eye wall. No community that sat comfortably outside the radius of catastrophic wind. The whole island was in it at once. The destruction this creates to the above-ground infrastructure of an entire island simultaneously is total in a way that is difficult for the response system to process. Normally in a disaster, damage is concentrated in an impact zone, and resources from outside that zone can move in to help. When the disaster zone is the entire island, when every road is blocked by debris, when every power line is down, when every cell tower is damaged, when the airport and the port that are the island's only connections to the outside world have both sustained significant damage, the logistics of response become exponentially more complex. First responders on these islands were themselves in the storm. Emergency personnel who will be needed for search and rescue, medical response, damage assessment, and community support spent the landfall hours sheltering in whatever structures their agencies had designated. They are emerging now into the same destroyed landscape that everyone else is emerging into, and they are beginning their work with whatever equipment survived the storm, which in some cases will be significantly less than what they had before it arrived. Search and rescue is the immediate priority. In the hours after a super typhoon passes, the most urgent task is finding people who are trapped, injured, or in immediate danger. Storm surge flooding, structural collapse, and landslides in the hillier interior portions of these islands all create situations where people need to be physically reached and extracted before other forms of help can be meaningful. Search and rescue teams, military personnel, local first responders, and federal urban search and rescue teams that were pre-positioned as close to the impact zone as conditions allowed are moving through the islands right now. The challenge is the debris. A super typhoon at this intensity doesn't just damage structures, it disassembles them and redistributes the pieces. Streets that existed before the storm, streets that emergency responders know by memory, may not be passable, not because of flooding alone, but because the physical material of buildings, trees, vehicles, and infrastructure that once lined those streets is now piled across them. Moving through a post-super typhoon landscape requires equipment that can clear debris continuously, and that equipment is itself in limited supply on a small island that just took a direct hit. The military is a critical part of this response in a way that is specific to Guam and differs from how most domestic disasters are handled. Andersen Air Force Base and Naval Base Guam, both of which sustained damage during the storm, but retained their core structural integrity because military construction standards are among the highest on the island, are now functioning as staging grounds for the response operation. Military helicopters, which are less dependent on road infrastructure than ground vehicles, are conducting initial aerial damage assessments and beginning to reach communities that cannot yet be accessed by road. Military medical facilities are receiving civilian patients. Military logistics capabilities, the ability to move large quantities of supplies quickly and efficiently, are being integrated into the federal response framework in real time. This integration of military and civilian response on a U.S. territory is one of the features that distinguishes the Pacific Island response from many mainland disaster scenarios, and in this case, it represents a genuine capability advantage. The military presence on Guam is substantial, its resources are significant, and its personnel, many of whom have been on the island long enough to have built ties to the civilian community, are motivated by more than duty orders. Water is the most immediate survival need in the storm's aftermath, and it is already in crisis. The island's water treatment and distribution infrastructure, pumping stations, treatment facilities, distribution lines depends on electrical power to operate. With the power grid down across the island, municipal water has stopped flowing in most areas. The water that residents stored before the storm, the bathtubs filled, the containers packed, is what exists right now. Pre-positioned bottled water from FEMA's advanced supply staging is beginning to move, but getting it physically to every neighborhood on an island where roads are blocked by debris takes time. In tropical heat, without air conditioning, in the stress of post-disaster conditions, dehydration becomes a real secondary threat in a timeline measured in hours, not days. Food supply is a longer timeline but worth understanding in context. Guam imports the significant majority of its food. The port through which that food arrives sustained damage. The airport through which air freight moves sustained damage. The supply chain that normally keeps grocery stores stocked on an island with no agricultural self-sufficiency is disrupted at multiple points simultaneously. This is not an immediate crisis in the first 24 hours. People have what they stored, and federal supply prepositioning provides a bridge, but it becomes increasingly significant as recovery extends into weeks, particularly for residents who were unable to prepare adequately before the storm. The people who are most vulnerable in the aftermath of a disaster like this are always the people who were most vulnerable before it. Elderly residents who could not easily evacuate and who may now be isolated in damaged structures. People with medical conditions that require medication, equipment, or regular medical attention. Families in the lowest income housing. The structures with the least typhoon-resistant construction, who have the fewest resources for self-recovery. Children, people with disabilities. The populations that emergency response systems always struggle most to reach quickly in complex disaster environments. These populations exist on Guam and in the Northern Mariana Islands in the same proportions they exist everywhere, and they are, right now, in the hardest circumstances of a hard situation. The federal response that has been activated is real, and it is significant. The question that always follows a disaster of this magnitude, in a geographically isolated territory, is not whether the response will be adequate in theory. It is whether it will be fast enough and large enough in practice, and whether the specific needs of island communities, needs that differ in important ways from mainland disaster needs, will be fully understood and addressed by a federal disaster response system that was largely built around mainland geography and infrastructure. After major typhoon strikes on U.S. Pacific territories in the past, the answer to that question has sometimes been yes and sometimes been no. After Typhoon Omar in 1992, after Super Typhoon Paka in 1997, after Super Typhoon Pongsona in 2002, after Super Typhoon Yutu in 2018, which struck Saipan and Tinian as a Category 5 and left communities without power for nearly a year. Each of those events revealed something about the gap between what these islands need in a major disaster and what they consistently receive. Each of those events produced promises of improved preparedness and more robust infrastructure investment, The state of those islands today, their power grid, their storm infrastructure, their emergency supply chains, reflects how completely those promises were kept. That accounting will happen again after this storm. It should happen, but it happens after the immediate survival phase is complete, and that phase is what is happening right now. A super typhoon just hit islands that most Americans have never thought about. 200,000 American citizens are waking up today to a landscape that looks nothing like the one they went to sleep in. They are looking for their neighbors. They are checking on their elderly relatives. They are standing in front of homes that no longer exist and processing what comes next, with the particular resilience of people who have faced this before and rebuilt before and will rebuild again. They are American. Their story is American. And what happens to them in the coming days and weeks, how fast the help arrives, how serious the commitment to their recovery turns out to be, says something real about what that actually means. We will stay on this, every update, every development, everything that comes out of these islands, as the picture becomes clear. Don't go anywhere.